Welcome to the Loins of History, a podcast dedicated to correcting political and historical illiteracy. My name is Jay. I'm joined by my co-host, as always, Collin. We are very excited to bring to you our next episode in our series on U.S. and Chinese relations. This week, we're going to focus on all the trade deals and agreements and things like that, really from 1980-ish, 1970-ish to the Xi Jinping era. So with that, Collin, what are some of those deals with the devil? Either the U.S. devil or the Chinese devil, depending on how you want to look at it. But what happened there?
Yes. No, it's a very complicated scenario where you had the Chinese, the US, they were trying to play off of each other. There was the Soviets that were kind of involved. So it's a very convoluted situation. But I personally believe that this was a deal with the devil on the US part, where we made a deal where we didn't really fully understand the intentions of the Chinese, the CCP. And long term, we are paying the consequences for that bad decision and the short-sighted decision. Whereas the Chinese, as we've talked about before, are very long-sighted, and they saw the future decades ahead of where they wanted to be. And we're going to go through that. But before we dive into these agreements and how we got to this point, I do want to start off in 1971. I think that's a really good year to start because a lot was happening. On the U.S. side, you had the Vietnam War, which was had turned into a debacle. Nixon was trying to get us out, peace with honor. At the same time, in the 60s, you had the Great Society program. So it's important to note that because the U.S. spending was out of control. We kind of say that tongue in cheek, thinking back to the 60s spending, but that's really where we started to see high levels of government spending, where it started to get really high, and faith in the dollar, which at the time was backed by gold, was at an all-time low. So our coverage of the dollar for gold was like 55%, dropped to 20%. So that ended up pushing us to leave the gold standard, which is important, and I'll come back to why. And then on the Chinese side, we were in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. So Mao Zedong was, I think, 4 or 5 years into the Cultural Revolution. He was purging all of the dissenters that he felt were inside the party. This is 10 years after the leap forward and the Great Leap Forward and the disastrous consequences for that. But if we look at it from where the U.S. is at, the U.S. is still an absolute superpower. They're an economic juggernaut, so to speak, definitely leading the world, and their main competitor was the Soviets. Meanwhile, the Chinese were still a third world country. They hadn't really even industrialized. The Great Leap Forward was a disaster. You had people making steel in the front yard with a clay oven, basically. Didn't work. Why was this kind of a deal with the devil where you had this superpower coming to this third world country? And I think it was partly because the U.S. felt like they could play off the Chinese to kind of counter the Soviets. And it's interesting, and Michael Pillsbury talks about this a lot in his book, The 100-Year Marathon, and a lot of interviews he gives. He goes, whereas the Chinese were looking at it almost as sitting on top of a mountain watching two tigers fight, and they wanted to play the U.S. off the Soviets, and they understood that they needed the U.S. to make this modernization jump. With Nixon's visit in 1971 and the U.S. leaving the gold standard, we pretty much formalized relations with the Chinese at this point. And remember from previous episodes, we abandoned Taiwan. We had now begun investing in China. And it's interesting, like we had some very influential people who would be influential later start making political careers out of this. I didn't realize this, but George Bush Sr. was actually worked in China for a long time. I think he worked as an ambassador.
He was also the rep to the, I believe, the American Institute in Taiwan, which is kind of our pseudo embassy there in Taiwan.
Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of where one of the places he started getting his political career, but I thought that was interesting. So at the time, the Chinese had a command-driven economy with Mao Zedong, and he truly believed in this command economy, very Stalinist, that they were going to dictate the terms. Obviously, that didn't work. Well, the United States, when you leave the gold standard, you create what's called a fiat currency. And I do want to touch on this because I feel like there's a huge misunderstanding today on what a fiat currency is.
Well, and currency considerations play a huge role in the relationship between US and Chinese trade. So this is a good introduction.
Exactly. So a fiat standard is, people say, well, we just have, it's just because people believe in it. It's not Santa Claus. It's not that everyone has to believe in it. Yes, there has to be faith in the dollar, but that faith is not in the dollar for the dollar's sake. What we say it is, it's the ability of the American economy, i.e., the taxpayer and businesses being able to produce and pay back the debt that they owe. So that's where we start getting into inflation rates and GDP growth and our ability. So right now we have like a $31 trillion deficit, but we're still able to pay back the debt we owe on that. So it's not like it's backed by nothing. We can
Yeah,
get
we're
into
not, the US government is not insolvent. Whereas there's some concerns about the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party currently, and its solvency. However, the US government is still very much solvent. We're not over leveraged in terms of debt. Yeah. Even though our debt is astronomical, we make a lot of money here.
But that's the point that we should keep in mind, that we are making money to pay the money we owe back. Now, is it sustainable? Do we need to make changes? That's a topic for a totally different podcast.
Another day.
I just want to point that out, that we now have a greater money supply. And so prior to 1971, our money supply was tied to gold. And like I mentioned, with that 55% coverage dropping to 20%, where, for every dollar, it was only backed by like 20% of our gold supply. You could only increase your money supply if you found more gold. Well, gold it's a limited quantity. You're not just going to find a bunch of gold and be able to take it back to Fort Knox. That's not really how it works. So in order to fund economic growth and infuse capital into an economy, you need money. So when we left the gold supply in 1971, we now were able to increase the money supply at a much, much, much greater rate in order to fuel economic growth. This is also partly because we didn't want to cut back on our spending in Vietnam or on the Great Society programs, which is why I mentioned them. Wow, that sounds familiar. That we didn't want to cut the budget. So that's kind of something we've been faced with for the past 50 years, but that we didn't want to do it. So we just figured we would increase the money supply. And this is how we did it. That's important to note, because even though Mao was a true Stalinist and he believed in a command economy, they weren't his inner circle at the time, but his smartest advisors and those in the CCP that he had pushed to the fringes, like Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, as we'll see, they understood that they could not have a pure command economy and modernize China the way that they wanted to do it. They knew that they needed capital. And where are you going to get capital? Well, the United States. We now have a country that has a massive amount of capital, the world currency, that we can have invested in our economy to help us grow. And they're going to have more money so that they can spend on goods and services that we can provide at a much cheaper rate. So you kind of have this, I think the idealists, and initially when they started this kind of process relationship between China and the United States, they initially envisioned, well, the US has all the money. They will buy the goods and they will give money to China for producing the goods. The United States people, the economy will benefit from cheap goods. The Chinese will benefit from an influx of cash by supplying this, and they can modernize. And it seemed kind of like this perfect match made in heaven. You now have a company or a country giving all this money and being able to receive something cheap. It's very market driven. However, it has not panned out like that, and it has not been all roses for the United States. Now, for China, as we'll see when we dive into this, it has done wonders for their economy. It is truly amazing when we see the amount of growth that they've had.
It's been an economic miracle.
It has been an economic miracle. And I just pulled some statistics just to kind of paint the picture of the two trajectories of the US and the Chinese economies and how they've varied. And so these are from the World Trade Organization. Since 1970, for China, they've only had 1 year of negative growth in GDP and total economic growth. And I think that was in like 1974. They've only had 5 years less than 5% GDP. 2004 manufacturing output was 625.22 billion. In 2022, it was 4.9 trillion. Inflation hasn't exceeded 5.9% since 2000. They did have a period of like crazy inflation in the late 80s, and that led to the Tiananmen Square riots and kind of uprising. And we'll get into that in a minute. Exports in 1970 were 2.9%. In 2022, they were 20.68% of their economy. China's trade balance for 2022 was 576 billion, and with the only year that they've had growth falling was in 2022. So whereas in the United States, and I think they've averaged, if you were just taking on average what their growth is, has been like 8%. It's crazy. 8% is massive, especially when you keep inflation at about 5.9% for the most part. Now, there's not a lot of direct evidence that I could find, but I absolutely think that they're doing some manipulation of the currency.
Yeah, that's what I was about to get into. Oh,
If you
your
want to touch on
currency
that,
manipulation.
yeah.
No, I was going to get into the reliability of these numbers because
Yeah.
it's worth a disclaimer at the minimum. So even though these numbers are the generally accepted stats that have come out of China, one problem in the business world with regards to China is China self-reports a lot of this stuff, and they do not allow other countries to independently verify their reporting. Whereas it's extremely common for other countries, like say the European Union, that American due diligence folks, analytics folks, etc., they will be allowed to go like check the books themselves. They'll be allowed to actually like go visit the factories. Like they will go and do all of this stuff because it's important for investors that if you're giving them all of this capital, that they're using it in the way that they say they're using it, it's growing in the way that they say that it's growing, etc. China is notorious for being extremely closed book and refusing to allow any independent verification of their numbers. So, with all that
I,
being said, sorry, go
I
ahead.
guess I should have said maybe currency manipulation wasn't the right thing, but that's more of market manipulation where they are closing the books. They're not allowing foreign, basically foreign eyes to come in and do due diligence. Like if you remember the housing crisis in 2008, part of the problem was nobody was doing due diligence in the United
Mm,
States, and it led to like this bubble bursting. Well, that's kind of happened a few times. Like if you look at China, there, there's a lot of talk about like the real estate market in China, how it's like artificially propped up by the state. And in a lot of ways it is. Like if you remember the Evergrande crisis where they had this huge real estate firm,
mm-hmm,
whatever,
mm-hmm,
defaulting on their loans, and it was essentially their bailout, their equivalent of a bailout where the Chinese government came in and bailed them out. That's happened a lot. And it
mm-hmm,
to kind of take it a step deeper, like if you look at China, they talk about this rapid urbanization and these massive buildings being built. Well, half these cities are empty, like they're just empty rooms and buildings being built
yeah,
because on the outside you see, wow, they're building these incredible cities and they have a huge population to sustain it. But then if you look a little deeper, you're like, well, nobody actually lives in this building. And so there's a lot of videos that, because in the age of the internet, you can see some videos that have gotten out where like there's just basically ghost cities where they're have less than 10% occupation, and they look beautiful on the outside and it attracts a lot of foreign investment,
mm-hmm,
but it's all a facade. It's a show. Like there
yeah,
was one I think they got busted for, it was, and this is not even in real estate, but it's actually in agriculture. There was these crops, and in order to make it look like from a satellite that they had these fields that were fully planted, they put fake crops out, and it was
hmm,
just rocks on top of poles. And when you actually went down on the ground and looked, you could see that it was all fake, but from a satellite it looked like there were crops in the ground. And you're
hmm,
like, oh, okay. So yes,
yeah,
Jay, that's a great point. You have to
yeah.
take
I
this
just
as
wanted
generally accepted.
Yeah, the reality is that China's economy has absolutely exploded. If you go Shanghai 40 years ago did not look anywhere remotely close to the way that it looks today. And a lot of good things have occurred. I just think it's important for our listeners to understand that a lot of these numbers, there's an asterisk next to them. Because we
Well,
don't know for sure what the books look like.
yeah, they might have inflation that's a little higher. They may not be able to pay all these debts, but And let's look at the US. And now these numbers we can verify. And there's both anecdotal evidence that we can sit around and kind of just look with our own eyes, as well as just tons of due diligence done on these. So, like in the US from the same time period, 1970 to now, we've had 8 years of negative growth. We've only had 1 year over 7% growth. Manufacturing in 1997 was like 16.9%, 0.09%. By 2021, it had decreased to 10%. And we've had a negative trade balance since 1975, meaning we import more than we export.
Those, Colin, those manufacturing numbers, those are 16% and 10% of GDP?
Yes. So
Okay.
thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. So you can see kind of two trajectories. One economy is becoming a mass importer of these goods and services. One of them is becoming a mass exporter. And you can see one of them is growing at an incredible rate, and the other is really not. We're still growing for the most part, but it is much slower. So why did this all happen? One man, Deng Xiaoping. And there's a lot of people that worked for him and other influential folks and people within the Chinese government and the US. But Deng Xiaoping's reforms post Mao were the catalyst to this growth. And that's probably the way I want to say it. So he had there's this policy of, and I'm sorry if I butcher this, but Bao Luan Fan Zhang. And it's basically correcting the wrong. So it's a Chinese idiom, and it does mean correcting the wrong. So he saw Mao and he didn't want to break fully from Mao because he worked for Mao. He was an ally of Mao-ish with some caveat to that because he fell out of graces for a while. But he didn't want to uproot communism in the CCP. He just wanted to correct the mistakes because he was part of the CCP during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. So he knew and he watched tens of millions of people in China die from these horrible policies from Mao. So he wanted to correct that, and he had to create a bunch of new policies and create a new vision, really, for what China was going to be in the CCP. And it started with, there was Mao. Remember, we had Stalinist thought, we had Maoist thought. Well, Deng had to figure out a way to reconcile Maoist thought and the CCP and their brand of communism to his vision. And his vision was much, much more moderate, in the sense that even though it was still going to be this communist party was going to be in control, the state was going to be a primary driver in the economy. It was no longer going to be a command economy. It was going to be a socialist market economy. And he had to make some very subtle distinctions within like ownership of property. So like under Mao, there was no private ownership of anything. Whereas Deng said, well, you're not bourgeoisie if you own a finished good that was produced because of the state. So you could own things like a car. You couldn't own a mine. That's something that the state needed to own. And he even took it a step further by allowing small amounts of private property ownership in combining some of these traditional Confucian Chinese ideals and infusing that into communism to kind of rebrand it. So those are some subtle distinctions that he wanted to allow, because if you remember, as an example, under Mao and the Great Leap Forward, they created these mass communes for farmers where they took away all the private property and you just worked a huge plot of land and everybody came in and you got fed, and then everybody starved. Because before that, you had small family plots of land. Well, he created like household responsibility. That was like one of his first acts was, okay, you're having a household responsibility to this small parcel of land where you need to grow food. You need to help support the economy. And that's how we're going to help feed ourselves. And it worked brilliantly. And so that kind of ties into the idea of, if you remember from Zhou Enlai, he initially proposed this post Great Leap Forward, the 4 modernizations, where they wanted to improve agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology, which is technically 5 if you separate science and technology. But I don't want to be, the 4 modernization sounds better than the 5. But, so that's where the household responsibility started with agriculture. It was like, okay, this is how we're going to reform agriculture and how we're going to feed ourselves so we don't starve during this economic revitalization. So then he also he took over from Mao in the late 70s. And so then in 1978, he had what was called reform and opening up. So he wanted to The state was still going to have primary ownership. They were also going to be a primary investor, but there was going to be, like I said, private property ownership and then also private enterprise. So there were certain economic zones that he created, especially in like Shenzhen City and some of these other areas where they would allow foreigners to come in and invest. So you had direct foreign investment coming into these cities, and it was almost kind of like a controlled environment where the Chinese government could absolutely keep an eye on this foreign dollars flowing in, and they could allow growth, and they could kind of do these little experiments, and they could experiment with, say, how are we going to grow here? And like Shenzhen City is one of the big ones where, yeah, I think in Shenzhen there's a saying that so in Shenzhen it's time is money, efficiency is life, and that came from this reform and opening up. And you had this economic zone that was designed around it, where you had foreign capital pouring into it, and the city exploded. And Deng Xiaoping had visited a few times and really marveled at the growth of that city. So it's kind of a twist of irony, really. So if you think back like 100 years ago, the open door policy in China. So 100 years ago, the open door policy where foreigners were just coming in and parceled up the country and basically dictated to the Qing dynasty, hey, this is really what we're calling the shots. We have basically full trade rights to your country. And they were, in a sense, in control. And the Chinese really hated that. And that was a huge point in Mao's revolutions was we're going to kick the imperialists out. We're anti-imperialist. Well, here Deng is kind of towing this very subtle line where he's reform and opening up to foreign investment in small blocks in these cities to kind of experiment with. But he wanted to keep tight control on that to make sure it didn't get, I guess, the foreign dollars didn't start corrupting the city. And so I just thought that was a kind of a twist of historical irony there.
Yeah, it is kind of funny that the century of humiliation from the Chinese perspective was defined by foreign intervention and the exploitation of the Chinese people and the Chinese economy. And here we are now, post Mao, on the beginning of the up and up for China. And the defining characteristic of all of this is foreign in economic intervention in their country.
Exactly. So, it's kind of like what I've said time and time again, that quote from Mark Twain, like history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Well, here it is. Yeah. It's rhyming. It's not the same, but it's extremely similar.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I just think that's interesting. So those first couple of years, Deng had to be very careful. And so he sort of towed the line, and he recrafted some of the language around communist ideals, how the communist economy was going to work, because it was no longer a command economy. They were going to accept that foreign cash flow as investment. And then they were going to build what he called a moderately prosperous society. And that's kind of a very Chinese way of saying, like, we're going to build the middle class. So, like, we're going to build back better. Basically saying, hey, we don't need to be the wealthiest people, but we are going to do the best we possibly can for the most amount of people, understanding that it's not going to be fully equal everywhere. We're not going to have equal, which is kind of the opposite again of Mao, where he was like, everybody is entitled to all these things. He was basically, within Deng's, the nuance of this was basically saying, we can affect the most people by doing these changes in our economy. And our goal shouldn't be everybody is the same, but it should be everybody should have a little bit of something, and we should be moderately prosperous. I think that's just a fancy way of saying, like, hey, we want a middle class where people can have a family and they don't have to starve, and they can be pretty much self-reliant and own a few things and be generally content with their life by infusing some of these ancient Chinese ideals into their work ethic and communism. We can build a moderately prosperous society. So you can see, like, the difference between Deng and Mao is pretty extreme if you look back at it, but he had to be very subtle with the changes that he implemented. And his whole goal, and, the first things we started talking about this episode was like, was this a deal with the devil? I should say there's some nuance behind that. And here's kind of the nuance. Like, I don't think Deng really set out to become like this global hegemon, and he wanted to stick it to the United States. I do think there was elements of, hey, we're going to watch the two tigers from the mountain. We're going to do what we can to get the best possible deal. Like, that's all fine and well and good. But I don't think it was fully exploitative at this stage. I think Deng really just wanted to not have another repeat of the Great Leap Forward, and he wanted what was best for the people of China. It evolves, and it's pretty rapid if you think about it in the scheme of history over the couple decades, and how it does turn out to be a disaster for the US. But some of the other, like I mentioned, the special economic zones, again, it's like on the coastal areas where it's exactly what was happening before. And then he had dual track pricing, which I do want to hit on this because under Mao, with like the grain shortages, like they set the prices, like the Communist Party set the prices, and they had all these price controls. And if you've ever studied history or economics, like when the government starts mandating price controls, like they never actually work. Like you can keep the price fixed, but there's always like an economic fallout that occurs. So they had what was called dual track pricing, and it's like 1984. So it allowed goods to be sold both at market and allow the government to set prices as well. So there's like two prices, and it basically forced the government to become more efficient because the government now had to compete with the free market. So it's kind of this weird way of saying like it's like giving the post office, FedEx, and UPS and Amazon, where they had to compete with them, and that's why they had to be better. And that kind of made me get a thought, like, it's not as simple as just getting money, going to the US and asking for a check. Like, how did they get a lot of this foreign investment?
Yeah, so as a part of Deng's reforms, the CCP applied and was accepted into the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in 1980. These two organizations, just for our listeners, like we're not going to go too far down the rabbit trail on, the nuances about these two organizations and what they did for China. It was just, in short, they were mechanisms for China to receive uh, foreign investment, loans, aid, that kind of thing. At the same time, in the early 1980s, China applies. So I actually believe it was 1986, so a little bit further. But China applies to what's called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GAF. This organization was the precursor to the World Trade Organization, the WTO. The U.S. would not support China's entry into the GAF, and later, when it became the WTO, we would not support their entry into the WTO until much later. So for now, as we're talking about Deng's reforms, they had joined the IMF, they had joined the World Bank. They had not yet fully integrated into like the global trade structure for various reasons.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Well, and so that kind of gives me another thought to go off of. With this influx of cash now within the economy, and like I mentioned, Deng having to toe this line between like kind of ideological beliefs and then practical growth and modernization, he had to be very pragmatic, and he understood that these reforms had to be done incrementally. You couldn't just, like with Russia post-Soviet Union with shock therapy, he didn't want to do that. He wanted a slow incremental growth. And so he relied on one of his advisors was Chen Yun. And Chen Yun is kind of similar to a lot of the like Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping in that they had been CCP members since the beginning in the Long March. And they had been pushed to the periphery and persecuted during the Cultural Revolution by Mao Zedong, and had under Deng Xiaoping had kind of come back into the party into favor. And Chen Yun was not as hardline as Mao. However, he was very conservative, and he was kind of like the anchor to this Chinese modernization to keep it from exploding to the point that they no longer were a communist country. So, with every reform that Deng had pushed, he had always relied on Chen Yun to kind of counterbalance it. So it was a very smart play to have. It was really truly like hey, I'm going to listen to both sides of the aisle, kind of practically speaking. If you look at it in US terms, like Chen Yun was the one that was saying like, hey, we need to make sure that we maintain our ideals. We don't need to completely open up. We still need state controls here, here, and here. I just wanted to bring that up because, as you mentioned, with loans come with terms, and all of this cash that's flowing into your economy, it can liberalize very, very quickly. And liberalize, I don't mean in the US sense, I mean in the classical sense, where it's going to open people up to freedoms, especially with private property ownership. So you have to be very careful if you're a communist country to not liberalize too much. Otherwise, you no longer become a communist party, and suddenly your communist party no longer has the power that it needs to command the state. Anyway,
Yeah, and that's essentially what's happened with guys like Jack Ma, who is the owner and founder was the owner of Alibaba. A lot of these like big time Chinese organizations, Alibaba is like the Chinese equivalent to Amazon, although that's not really happening anymore. But guys like Jack Ma, they go around and they kind of, like you say, call them liberalize, and then they begin to fall out of favor with the CCP. So
and then a lot of them disappear. There's a lot of Chinese billionaires and millionaires who have just straight up disappeared. Jack Ma disappeared
yeah.
for a long time. Did he ever like show back
Yeah,
up?
he's back. And this is more on the not conspiracy theory, but like unofficial side of the house, is that Jack Ma's basically like forbidden from doing or saying anything. So he's like in a de facto house arrest, but not like in house arrest, if that makes any sense.
That's kind of a weird, not really weird, but that's kind of a, it's sort of like Zhao Enlai and Deng Xiaoping. Like they were under house arrest. Like they weren't necessarily going to be executed by the party, but they were basically told like, hey, you're going to stay in your house and around your house and you're not going to do anything. And you're going to be alive for appearances, but you're not going to say anything controversial. Because I didn't
Yeah.
even, I remember Jack Ma for like prior to his disappearance was like super involved in social media. He was all over the place. And then it was like he just disappeared and the conspiracy theories came out. And I didn't know if he was still alive. That's how much
Yeah,
he's disappeared.
there's just something about like Chinese court intrigue that is, if you're into that kind of thing, like if you enjoy like the part about the Game of Thrones plot, like just like the knife fights that would go on behind closed doors type deal, if that's intriguing to you, like Chinese history is fascinating, where all these different dynastic struggles, it is alive and well in the CCP today. I mean, heck, just I feel like weeks ago there was the former Chinese ambassador to the U.S. I want to say his family name was Wang. Maybe that was the other guy. Anyway, I forget, but this dude, like he was the ambassador to the US. He did such a good job. He's one of Xi's boys, gets brought back to China, becomes like basically the head ambassador. He's not the chairman of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So he's not like their Secretary of State equivalent, but he's like their top ambassador. And then all of a sudden he just disappears. And there was like all these wild speculations going on the internet that he had like had an affair with some Hong Kong journalist and all this like crazy stuff. And then come to find out, like after about a month, it's like, oh yeah, we had to fire him. And then it's like, shoot, like this dude was the equivalent to like on the US side, John Kerry, or like special advisor for like climate change or something like that, where he's not the Secretary of State, but he's a pretty senior administration official. It's like the equivalent of John Kerry just disappearing, and then a month after the fact being like, oh yeah, we had to let him go. Anyway, it was just this like bizarre, there's all these speculations on why that occurred, but yes, this is very much still happens in the CCP, where people just like extremely high up senior people just disappear.
Like imagine Jeff Bezos just disappearing, and it's like the U.S. government took control of him and his company for like 2 years, and then he just showed back up and was like, "Okay, I'm just going to be quiet now and hang out." It's hard
Yeah,
for us
that's
to
exactly what
fathom.
happens. Yeah.
Back to Dang. So right now we have a rapidly growing China. You know, they had some economic turmoil with this in the late 80s. So they had some ownership reforms, and that occurred in 87. And then in 88, they had price and wage reforms. And like I mentioned, there was a huge jump in inflation. I think in 1989, it got to like 25% in 1 year. So that's massive. And that gave rise to like everybody's seen like the pictures of Tiananmen Square. Actually, like, and people don't realize this, and I didn't realize it until I was actually like in the mid 2000s or later, that like Tiananmen Square was not just like this protest in Tiananmen Square that day and they had the tanks roll in and the guy stood out in front of the tank. It wasn't just like that day, or it wasn't a one day or kind of a protest thing. Like think like summer of 2020 where there was riots, there was like a ton of chaos. There's reports that like thousands of people died and were injured, and it was a very tumultuous time. And it goes back to a lot of it ties into this inflation and now this liberalizing of the country. And people are like, hey, I want, now that I own a few things and I have some money, I want to be kind of on my own. And the Chinese very quickly got that under control, and a lot of people disappeared and were killed. But it had a lot to do with this new economic liberalization. Wages suddenly, inflation spiked. People were really pissed now because they had some money. It seemed worthless. They ended up rioting. There's way more to the Tiananmen riots and Tiananmen Square. I just wanted to tie it in to kind of overlay it with what was going on economically. That's a whole podcast for another day.
Yeah. And sorry, if I may, during the Tiananmen Square took place at a time of rapidly growing cooperation between the US and China. And there were a lot of these agreements where a lot of the agreements were predicated on not just opening up of the Chinese economy, but this growing concern about human rights. So it would actually be Bill Clinton who would formally tie what was then called most favored nation status. And we've talked about most favored nation in previous episodes. It's now called normal trade relations. So we've gotten rid of the term most favored nation status. It's now called normal trade relations. Bill Clinton actually tied this economic status to human rights. But in 1989, when Tiananmen Square happened, like it was highly problematic because there was a lot of positivity in talks at the like, think State Department action officers would go to China and they would receive people from China, and everyone's like, yeah, we're finally getting along, like everything's kosher. And then all of a sudden, kind of by surprise, we find out, oh my gosh, we actually think they've massacred a lot of people. And so like it was highly problematic. And we actually, I think the Bush administration sanctioned certain CCP officials and business leaders, etc. Behind closed doors. We were kind of looking at them and going, WTF, folks, like everything was great. Now you've put, me, U.S. government representative, in a pickle because we've been working really hard to increase all these trade agreements. And now I got on NBC News, you guys murking your own people. and that it was extremely problematic for a whole host of different reasons.
Well, you bring up a good point. Thinking about it geopolitically, in 1989, early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, the Soviet Union was like the number one enemy for decades. And they had been an enemy because we had always pictured them as somebody who commits human rights violations. They are tyrants. They're communists. So the US, in order to open up trade with China, had to kind of prove to its own people that, hey, they're not the same as the Soviet Union was. And so, like you said, wow, now we're in a pickle because turns out they're just like the Soviet Union in a lot of ways when it comes to like how they treat their people. And they'll send them to camps. People will just disappear. Like they don't have a problem necessarily putting down a riot with live ammunition. They don't have a problem with it. But now the U.S. is associated with it because of these trade agreements. We spent decades sanctioning the Soviet Union now. And so, yeah, you're right. That's a good point. And I feel like the early 90s especially were like this time of boundless ideological feel-good attitude where we just beat the Soviets. Human rights are everything, and we can have world peace through all these agreements. It was almost like, looking back on it, it was almost very naive to think, just looking at the world as it is now, but it was very naive to think that that was not possible, but just that's how other foreign states would act in good faith. And as we'll see in a little bit, but yeah.
And that's been, so this is the tension. This is why we wanted to call this episode Deals with the Devil, right? Like the tension is there's nothing wrong with the Chinese people, right? It's like when we talk about these disagreements with China, it's easy to kind of assume we're talking about every single individual that lives in China, and that is grossly misleading. The problem, and this is why Tiananmen Square was such a wake-up call, and very much like a precursor to how a lot of the conversations are going today, is At face value, it makes a lot of sense for there to be a positive and robust relationship between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America and just the West writ large with China. It makes a lot of sense. The problem is that the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, they resort to these not just authoritarian measures, but just downright unethical, and that's putting it lightly, downright unethical measures that, I think we here in the United States and the West, we have to look at ourselves and go, wait a minute, we are getting further and further in business with an institution, the CCP, that has no problem killing its own people for no other reason than wanting democracy. That was fundamentally what Tiananmen was about. They were waving American flags, like they wanted a more democratic process, and they were murdered. So as we get into what's going on today, and not to get too far ahead, but like with Xinjiang and the Uyghurs during the Clinton administration, like what's going on in Tibet, which, oh, by the way, folks, it's to live in Tibet now is way worse than it was back in the 90s when we heard a lot about this like free Tibet type stuff. It's it is bad in Tibet. Anyway,
Or
like
look at
there's these
Hong Kong very recently.
Hong Kong has completely gone down the drain. uh, anyway, we all say that like this tension here is that like at face value, it makes a lot of sense to increase our trade and cooperation with China. The unfortunate reality is that the CCP is not a good organization to be doing business with.
So I, I don't like I don't like pointing to like a specific event and saying like here's where the trajectory shifted, because I feel like it's always a host of reasons where things change. But like I mentioned, I think Deng had the best intentions for his people, and I think he wanted to kind of create a quasi middle class or their equivalent. But after Deng Xiaoping, there was the three represents. So that was with his successor Jiang Zemin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but the three represents where you could really see that now the Chinese government, I should say, were going to now advocate for the Chinese to be the leader. No longer was it like, hey, we're going to make ourselves better. It's like, hey, now we're going to be better than you. And within the three represents, so it's represented can be kind of read really in context to like incorporate. So like, hey, we're going to do this. So representing advanced productive forces, representing advanced culture, and representing the broad masses. So, the first one of those represents productive forces, where the CCP is going to represent the most advanced productive forces in China. So like whatever the interests are in our for whatever our productive forces are, the most productive force, the CCP will back that. If it is producing the most, we are going to back that no matter what. Representing advanced culture. So this is now where we are going to advance the Chinese culture over everything else. And so then representing the broad masses, where they are no longer, or they're going to represent the broad interest of the CCP common people. So workers, farmers, everything all the way up to CCP members. So this, I think, is kind of a turning point where no longer was it like, hey, we're just going to make ourselves better for its own sake. We're now going to represent the best interests of our people over the world writ large, or even the US. To be completely honest, if I was your average Chinese person in Shenzhen or Shanghai, I would actually be okay with this, because I would expect the government to have my best interest. And looking at this, I'm like, well, yeah, I want them to look at me over another country. The problem is, I don't think the US really took this seriously. And I don't think I think they were still maintaining these trade agreements that were really hurting the US. And we can get into this in a second, but starting here in 2000, you can see the US economy really, truly start to get hollowed out in what a lot of people unfortunately call flyover country. And that resonated with a lot of people. And we act shocked when in 2016, some guy comes around and says, hey, everybody kind of forgot about you and screwed you over for the past 20 years. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to represent your best interests. And then we're stunned that this man came out of nowhere. And it's not just that one man. There was another man on the complete opposite end of the spectrum that basically said the same exact thing. He was just like, hey, everybody's trying to screw you guys over. I'm going to help you out here. And here's one of the biggest enemies. They had two totally different paths to fixing the problem, but they recognized the problem. And it should come to no surprise to anybody. We'll dive into the American economy now. But Jay, did you have
Collin,
any thoughts?
tell us, who are those two men, Collin?
For anybody that couldn't pick up on those hints, it's Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. So two people who are polar opposites politically, personally, in every way, shape, and form, complete opposites. But their message was essentially rooted in the same kind of, I don't know.
They were appealing to
the forgotten man, the forgotten person.
Broad category of people who consisted of people on both the politically right and the left, who, when the economy starts to stagnate and or goes down, people lose jobs and they appeal. We might have to put it in the show notes, but Wall Street Journal did a fantastic article, and they talked about how of the 100 most affected counties in the United States from we're about to get into, and that's called the China shock, this adjustment of the U.S. economy to increase trade with China. Of the 100 counties, Donald Trump won either 80 or 90% of them on the Republican side. He won the Republican nomination, and on the Democratic nomination side, Bernie Sanders had a comparable number. I forget exactly what it was, but it was the two of them. Their narrative very much resonated with the specific locations that had significant manufacturing job loss. And they don't have to be just a Republican. The populist movement is not exclusively limited to the Republican Party. Bernie Sanders was absolutely trying to mobilize it on the left and the Democratic Party side. And the whole point here is to say that these economic considerations, and this is a good way to tie it to how hey, these are big lofty trade deals between two governments that absolutely affect everyday people, whether you live in rural North Carolina or Tennessee, or if you live in Canada somewhere, or if you live if you're a Netherlands farmer. We've mentioned those dudes and dudettes before too. So these trade deals, when you lose your job and it's because your job just went to China, that changes how you vote. That's essentially what we're trying to say.
So I'm going to, like you said, those lofty trade deals. And here's where I'm going to put on my big American ball cap, where go USA here. But when you talk about these lofty trade deals, in the immediate term, you can look at the US and say, wow, look at these U.S. companies, record profits, productivity is through the roof. We're doing great. And then you start sifting through the reality of those numbers. You start to see that it is not go back to 1971. I see this on social media from the most left-wing socialist to the most right-wing populist. In 1971, they point to a graph of productivity versus wages, and wages have basically stagnated. And, everybody's talking about inflation now. When you don't really have a real economy, it's completely financialized, where only a few groups at the very top are truly benefiting. You're going to have a lot of unrest. And so these lofty trade deals look good for some geek looking through the numbers on an Excel spreadsheet. And I use that term pejoratively, and I use it intentionally because I don't think a lot of people who grew up going to private school in an Ivy League university, who spent their whole life in a consulting firm looking through Excel numbers, truly understand the hurt that a lot of Americans felt in this. If you were to drive, and if you don't live in a flyover state, or you don't live in the Southeast or whatever, I recommend that you drive through, not just on highways, but go through some of the state highways, and you can see small towns like McCormick, South Carolina, Hickory, North Carolina, Kingsport, Tennessee, West Point, Georgia, before Kia moved into Alabama, you can see, like, just across the border, you see decimated small towns, towns that were, 1,500 to 10,000 people, maybe not big, forgettable cities that nobody really ever heard of, other than a few people that might have been born and got out because they were famous. In those cities, you would have one plant that would manufacture something, whether it was textiles, automotives, just raw steel, coal in West Virginia,
Furniture.
places, furniture, Hickory, North Carolina. And suddenly, these plants were very successful. They can employ people who maybe they didn't even graduate high school for whatever reason. And I know socially we look down on those people, but in the 70s and 80s, people didn't graduate high school even then because their parent died or they had to go to work and they had to start working. So they just didn't have the opportunity. They would have to go work at a plant, and they can make good wages at a plant working on a factory line. And for somebody that never graduated high school or only graduated high school or maybe took a few classes at community college, working these jobs is actually really good. It's stable, it's good wages, and the economy in the local area is supported. So let's take a city of 5,000 people, but you have a plant there that employs like 500. That's 10% of the population. I guarantee you, if you drive through some of those small cities, every other business would be supporting that one. So the entire economy of this small town is reliant on that plant. Well, when you start having trade agreements like the TPP, NAFTA, I know that's not really China, that's North American Free Trade Agreement, where suddenly now at a corporate level, you have somebody that's looking at the numbers and says, hey, we could save 5% by just taking this factory and shipping it overseas. Why not? It makes sense. Suddenly now you lose 500 jobs in a town of 5,000, and every other job is affected by it. That town is effectively hollowed out. And then people turn around, and I heard this all the time in the early 2000s. Well, we just need to reskill them, teach them how to code. Okay, it's not that easy to teach somebody who never had an opportunity, who's 45 and never had an opportunity to go to college or even graduate high school to learn how to code. That's the biggest bunch of trash I've ever heard in my life. You can't just teach them how to code in a few years and expect them to go work for Google. It's not how it works. So
Yeah.
suddenly those towns have no economy. There's no hope. They're desperate. Well, give them, overprescribe them opiates, which is what's happened over the past 20 odd years. Suddenly now you have an opioid crisis. Suddenly now you have an unemployment crisis. We're 2 generations into this. People, because we don't produce anything in our country, we have no real backbone economically speaking. So we can't actually afford to. Now we're getting to the point where we can't afford things, and inflation's through the roof. Nobody has a solid job. People are losing them, and it's creeping up. It started with the lower middle class, but you can see this economic pinch is just creeping up and up and up and up a little bit higher. So everybody's starting to feel it, and that middle class is shrinking little by little because we decided that we wanted cheap stuff from Walmart instead of, hey, I'll pay a few dollars more if I can have it in the United States. And so then we look at the employment numbers and you're like, well, employment numbers look great, blah, blah, blah. Well, working for minimum wage, as we said, wages haven't kept up with inflation or with productivity. Right. If I'm working for minimum wage at a place that sells cheap goods, it's not like I'm going to be able to afford anything, of value. I have to buy this cheap crap. And if you've ever gone to, like, again, Walmart, you literally almost cannot find anything made in the US. It's such an apparition that people will advertise that it is from the United States as like a marketing ploy to buy something. And chances are the materials it's a finished product that probably then took a few other finished products to make were not made in the US.
Mm-hmm. So,
man, I'm sorry. I'm going on a rant here, but
no, it's okay.
It sticks to me because then now you have people who don't really want financial aid. They don't want government assistance. They really just want a job in a steady economy. And we've sort of robbed that and hollowed out really. And it's not, and again, you can look at it. It's not just like Hickory, North Carolina or McCormick, South Carolina. Now look in big cities. You can't even go to parts of cities anymore. It looks like a zombie apocalypse because the drug epidemic is so bad. And because now, like I mentioned, that this economic pinch is moving up the ladder of social classes, middle class. So you can't have any sort of thriving. The economy is not thriving and people are suffering all because we wanted cheap stuff. And I want to tie it back to that. Anyway, and I would say the last thing, it crosses pretty much every demographic boundary. You can look at the Southeast in any small town. McCormick has a very different demographic breakdown than Hickory, North Carolina, but they were both at one point very moderately prosperous small towns where you could feel safe, you could get a good job, and you could live a nice, quiet life with really no government aid until you robbed the one thing that was providing for them. End of rant.
Yeah. And no, that's good. And Colin, you really captured the emotional angst that uh, I hope our podcast kind of speaks to, and that is, we want to explain today with history, and when understanding our current political situation, here in the United States, and I would be willing to bet in Canada and in Europe and elsewhere, everything seems kind of politically more volatile, and one of the primary causes of political volatility, if not the primary cause, isn't actually these like ideological considerations. May I be so bold to say that, like, from if you're on the political right, you might say that wokeism is the number one issue, and whether or not it's an issue is another conversation. However, I would actually believe that it's actually economic considerations that drive a lot of those other issues. And when it comes to, like, okay, if the political volatility is actually being caused by economic considerations, then we have to look at and say, hey, one of the most impactful things to our current economic situation is the opening up and rapidly increased trade and business agreements with China. I mentioned before, this is called China shock, and it has done a ridiculous amount of damage to everyday American people. Few things here just to kind of illustrate how this is not an easy problem to solve. So two positive things and then five negative things about increased trade to try to, maybe put a bow on a lot of thoughts that we've covered here. First of all, by one reason why you see a lot of things, not everything, but a lot of manufactured goods being made in China is because they are actually cheaper. And in principle, that's a good thing. It's a good thing for the average American consumer that their goods cost less, i.e., capitalism, which we are all still capitalists here. Well, Colin and I are still capitalists here. I actually really hope people who disagree ideologically with us listen to the podcast. I would love to not keyboard warrior debate with any of these people. I'm not into that. I definitely do not have any time for that. But like, I love intellectually stimulating conversations. That's what I mean when I say engage. So like, I would love to hear the feedback, and I hope y'all are listening. But it's by lowering the cost of goods, it makes things cheaper, and it increases a metric known as purchasing power, i.e., your dollar, your average American person, your dollar actually goes further because the things that you're buying cost less, if that makes any sense. By some estimates, some conservative estimates, and this might sound like a drop in the bucket, but some estimates is that in the last 20 years, increased trade with China has actually increased the purchasing power of the average U.S. household by some $1,500, $1,500. Someone might say, oh, that's nothing. Well, if you consider inflation, we talk about how it's completely ruined a lot of people's livelihoods. Inflation since COVID has increased the average cost of goods by roughly the same number. So to say like, okay, inflation's done really bad things, which it has, I'm not trying to dismiss that, then we also have to say that by increasing the purchasing power of the average U.S. household by the same number, roughly $1,500, is also a really good thing. So it's like there are good things out there. And the second thing that increased trade with China has actually done good things for the U.S. is that when businesses are able to cut costs, that increases their income, right? Like when you're looking at a balance sheet, if your cost goes down, your profit goes up, right? So when profit goes up, businesses are able to expand and invest more stuff here in their US operations. For example, Amazon is a great case in point. Amazon is able to sell a lot of things that are made in China. And as they bring all of these Chinese manufactured goods here in the United States, that requires a absolutely massive distribution, shipping, and supply network that, we're not bringing in Chinese workers to drive the trucks here in the United States, right? Those are Americans that are being employed. So it may not be the American that's making the chair or the lamp that you wanted to buy on Amazon, but now they've got a new job driving it to your door. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but like I see Amazon packages on everybody's door all the time. And so when these same businesses they it does create jobs here in the United States. It just takes other jobs away. And the problem, and Colin alluded to it, is how do we adjust from, okay, this particular sector has significantly shrunk, but there's new things. And just kind of anecdotally here, in the last 30 years, by far the most growth industry has been the IT industry, like think computers, think technology, that kind of thing. That is a significantly higher skill industry than the manufacturing industry, right? Like if I'm a factory plant worker, I don't need a bachelor's degree to be able to do that job. But if I'm going to be a software engineer and I'm going to create an app, then, well, debatable if you need a bachelor's degree, but it is a higher skilled job. And it's not exactly easy to transition from being I'm the guy that assembled this table to I'm now designing an app for a company. So it's that transition that we've not transitioned very well. Those are before I get into the 5 bad things. Colin, is there anything you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, no, I'll wait till after you say the negatives, because you touched on like 3 things that I really want to go back to, and I think it ties into the way Dang did it. So go ahead.
Okay, good. So there have been some negative things. Number one, and we've mentioned this, but just to like officially throw that out there, specifically the U.S. manufacturing sector, where we assemble goods that are sold and consumed in U.S. markets, the manufacturing sector, it was completely wrecked by specifically China joining the World Trade Organization, which I don't know, or actually, yeah, when China joined the WTO, I believe in 1999, and in 2000, when they were given permanent normal trade relations, or what used to be called most favored nation status, that initiated a process that completely devastated the U.S. manufacturing sector. And we've talked a lot about that. The second one is intellectual property theft. And when Congress looks at a lot of the issues today, probably the main one that your senators and representatives are trying to solve is the intellectual property theft. Proprietary information or information that legally belongs to a particular business is a significant source of revenue, i.e., you can if you have a great idea and somebody else wants to use that technology, you can sell it to them, you can lease it to them, you can make money off of your proprietary information. Well, if the Chinese business X steals your intellectual property and your proprietary information, you're not making any money off of it. So a huge lobbying effort on current US businesses is to try to get Congress to prevent the Chinese from stealing their frickin' stuff. We could talk a lot more about that. One of my favorite U.S. government acronyms is CFIUS, or it's CIFUS, the Council. Oh man, of course I'm going to forget what it stands for. Why did I do this on the podcast? Oh, committee. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. Whew. or CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., the United States. This committee has rapidly expanded. It's an interagency organization that's sole purpose in life is that any foreign company wants to acquire a U.S. company, this committee reviews it, and they kind of go, and it's kind of taken on a national security bent, where if we believe there's technology related to national security, if all of a sudden we see that there's a Chinese business who is required, Chinese businesses per Chinese law are required to share information with the Chinese government. If this Chinese business wants to buy, radar technology, it gets reviewed by CFIUS and they will make a recommendation on yes or no. And actually, the Obama administration was pretty aggressive in denying some things via CFIUS. The third thing is currency manipulation, and we kind of touched on that earlier. Long story short, the Chinese do. So the Chinese currency is called the renminbi. And what they do is they either artificially or authentically, depending on what numbers you want to look at, keep the value of the renminbi low. And what that does is that makes Chinese goods cheaper to export. So China, Colin kind of mentioned the trade imbalance, and we're in is it the billions or trillions of dollars of a trade deficit, Colin?
In the trade deficit, we're in billions still.
Okay.
We're on our way to a trillion, but not yet.
So we're in a several $billion trade deficit with China, i.e., the United States, imports many, many times more goods from China than we export to China. That's what that trade deficit means. And what the currency, China wants this. China wants the United States, a much wealthier economy. Our GDP per capita is significantly higher than what it is in China. And they want us to be buying Chinese goods because that keeps Chinese businesses in business. So if the value of their currency is lower, that means the cost of their goods is lower. And if the dollar is more expensive, that means our dollar goes further in China. That means it's easier for us to buy Chinese goods. So it helps China maintain its export focus. Now, what that also does is it makes, because the dollar is higher, and China is one of the main countries that actually likes to buy US dollars. And when you buy something, basic supply and demand here, if you lower the supply and the demand goes up, the cost of that specific thing goes up, right? Currency is something that gets traded on the market, on the international market. And when China buys a dollar, that makes the value of the dollar go up. And when they're spending renminbi to go do that, in other words, they're selling renminbi, and it's just like selling a stock. When all the stocks get sold, the price of the stock goes down. So when they sell renminbi to buy US dollars, the value of the dollar goes up, the renminbi goes down. That keeps their goods, the value, the cost of their goods much cheaper, and it helps them be an export economy. Okay, I hope I didn't lose anybody there, but Colin, did you want to say something?
No, those were great points.
I got two more.
Keep going.
So real quick, just for the sake of time, we've kind of touched on this, but number 4 here, that a negative outcome of trading with the U.S. and China has been all of the labor and human rights violations in China. So one example, fairly recent, when China was still enforcing its zero COVID policy, there was an iPhone factory in Guangzhou. So Apple is an American company. They're actually one of the best American companies, if I do say so myself. And no, I am not an Apple employee. I'm just iPhone guy, not an Android guy. Apple is made in America. And that's a nuanced made in America. It's an American company. We'll say that. There's a lot of things. Anyway, there was this it was an iPhone factory in Guangzhou, and they're due to COVID policies and just other economic things, they had this huge riot because their working conditions sucked. And these videos came out. Some of y'all may have seen them. This is an example of how when American companies do business in China, China is not exactly responsible, and Chinese businesses are not exactly responsible with how they treat their workers. And this is ironic because, as all socialist countries are to be workers' paradises, this is clearly not the case. So that's number 4. And number 5, and lastly, one of the bad things here is, and this is one of the shortfalls of the World Trade Organization, when a government heavily subsidizes their businesses or those kinds of companies, what that does is that allows those companies to sell their goods cheaper. So a common allegation from Western governments is that the CCP, because it's such a command, we talked about Deng making it a market economy, but Xi Jinping has made it back on the command economy side. These government subsidies are labeled as some to be unfair practices that decrease, that make competition more difficult. And it's just because China is not a capitalist market economy anymore. These government subsidies are seen as unfair. They make Chinese goods much cheaper and therefore, difficult to produce, competitive goods on our end. So all that to say is that this is not a easy problem to solve. And if our listeners can zoom out with me for a second, I kind of focused on cost of goods on both the positive and the negative side. And that is like lower cost of goods is in some ways good, but in other ways it's bad. And that makes this like, oh shoot, like there's actually not a good and easy way to solve this problem.
You can't just look at it as, well, there's 5 bad things, there's 2 good things. It's kind of like well, how are we going to weight those items to see which was this long-term bad or good? Right. I think real quick, just as we start getting into wrapping up here, we kind of titled this and said, did we make a deal with the devil? In a sense, yes, because the devil we made a deal with had a better plan than we did. They had a long-term plan, and I don't think we really did. I don't think we fleshed this out. And also that devil had the best interest of the people of China in mind, where I don't think that we did. We had certain interests, and certain groups were more important than others, not so much the American people as a whole. Because like Deng Xiaoping's incremental approach, he knew that you couldn't just shock the economy into, otherwise you'd get just what happened in Russia, where massive wealth inequality and really just didn't work out. He did it much better. Now, there's a lot of things he did badly, but the U.S. kind of didn't. We're just like, well, we can get cheap stuff. That's my perception. And when I say perception, that kind of leads me to this point. We started getting into politics a little bit. I think people need to kind of think of it like this. Politics is not about policy. The marketplace of ideas, we can throw that around and be like, well, I want to watch the debate. People vote for whoever makes them feel a certain way. And it's kind of like if you've ever been in sales, like, people don't buy off of facts. They buy off of how things make them feel. And if you have candidates that come up there and start saying things that resonate with how you're feeling at the time, like, you're going to vote for that person. If you have somebody that comes up there and says, I'm going to get your job back, I'm going to set things right, we made mistakes, 100% of the time, you're going to empathize with that person. That's why Bernie and Trump have such strong followings and people that are diehard and completely emotionally invested in them. So they just captured the angst that a lot of people are feeling, and to myself included to an extent. And that's kind of why I went on that little bit of a rant, and I hope it wasn't too touchy-feely for everybody. But, and then the last point I would say is, I'm a capitalist with a few caveats. I think I'm not like a Milton Friedman-esque kind of guy where I just let the free market dictate it. I think there do need to be some kind of controls, because otherwise you're going to see what happens here. And there's a definite human element that you have to look in. And I think that the U.S. really executed this poorly long-term, and a lot of people ended up getting hurt because of it. And I think we've made the case for why, and you can see very clearly that of the two, one country is doing much better with this agreement, all things considered, with this agreement, if you're going to look at this in a vacuum, one execution has been a lot better than the other, I think. So we'll let you draw your own conclusions based on what we talked about.
Yeah, here in the United States, we oscillate between Republican and Democrat administrations. The CCP has had one party in power the entire time. And
It's amazing.
what that allows the CCP to do is to maintain a level of continuity in policy that the United States isn't able to maintain. So when it comes to our trade, and Collin, to your point, like, we didn't have a long-term plan because, American politics operates in 2 to 4 year increments.
We're basically,
And
you're making deals with a schizophrenic with multiple personality disorder.
right. In the grand scheme of things, I absolutely prefer our political system over the Chinese one. However, a trade-off is that we're not able to maintain that continuity, and it just kind of is what it is in that regard. So I hope this has been a helpful kind of overview of, the defining characteristic post Mao, really beginning with Deng Xiaoping and his predecessors have carried it on, has been, what is the trade and economic situation like between our two countries? Go ahead, Collin.
Predecessors or successors?
Sorry, successors. Thank you, Collin. Not Mao's predecessors, his successors. Thank you. And that, this is a series on U.S. and Chinese relations. The last 40 years have been what's the trade like? What's the economics like? What's the finance like? So that's why we wanted to cover that. We hope y'all enjoyed this episode. Please give us some feedback. Please click the links in our show notes if you want to follow us on Instagram or our Facebook page. Collin and I are also on Twitter. You can just search Loins of History and you'll find us, or like I said, the links are there in the show notes. Of course, if you like what we're doing and you want to support us here, if you're on Spotify, you can click support. We also have a Patreon page that you can click the link in the show notes as well. And most importantly, we value your feedback. If you like this episode, the very best thing you can do is to give us a 5-star review and leave a comment. Not all of the podcast hosting platforms allow us to see who gives us a 5-star review. We have to see the comment to see. And if you give us a 5-star review, we will give you a shout out. And I want to give a shout out this week to my man, Dean Hibbler, who not only did he give us a awesome 5-star review and a comment there on Podcast Addict, but he emailed us personally.
He went above and beyond.
And he went above and beyond. And Dean, I genuinely appreciate your feedback and your comments to making this podcast better. So thank you to Dean. We love hearing from our listeners. If you want to email us, our email is loinsofhistory@gmail.com. Both Collin and I will see it. So give us a review that tells the algorithms that you like it and will help other listeners find this show. And with that, we hope you enjoyed this episode and we look forward to seeing you next week.